my first like 1 or 2 weeks at this school, the principal took me out of class. So I'm like 13 years old. She like took me out of class in the hallway, and she's like, "Hey Gus, like, I know you're new to this school. We're happy to have you. Like, you seem to be like a really good student. You're getting along with everyone. I just want to let you know, like, this is like a very like close-knit community. Like, we don't tolerate any gangs or any gang activity." And I was like, what? Like, what? And it immediately clicked in my head that I had just shaved my head. So like, and that's how I've always, I've up until that point, I had always shaved my head. And I realized what she was saying. So I was like, oh, no, I'm not a gangbanger. I just shaved my head. And then she was quick to be like, I'm not saying you're a gangbanger. I'm not saying you belong to anything. I am just saying we don't like tolerate that stuff in the school. So like right off the bat, like I was made to feel like, hey, like your Mexican level is too Mexican. Like you're like for everyone else, I was like the stereotype of like what a Mexican was. But then I would go home and I wasn't Mexican enough.
Anyway, thanks for joining us, man. I'm really excited to chat with you. And is this your first podcast?
This is my second podcast, but I mean, like my first podcast I did years ago. So yeah, sure. This is my first podcast.
What was that one about?
It was just like a talkative, just, kind of like Joe Rogan type deal where I was talking with like a buddy of mine, and it was basically just recording a conversation that we had.
Gotcha. I feel you. I get it. But now you're like this big deal publisher. Now you're on a book tour.
I mean, I don't know about that, but I don't know about the big deal part, but yeah.
How does it feel, man? Are you excited about the book? I definitely want to get into that later though.
I'm so pumped. It's kind of surreal just because like, it starts off, you're by yourself working on this thing. No one else knows about it. All they know is just, you can't go out. You can't hang out. Like you can't do these things because you're just busy, because I'm busy writing all the time. And then you get into the stage of like the publisher, still no one knows about it. And then all of a sudden I'm just like, hey, I've got this book and here's the cover and here's all this, like, and people are like shocked. It kind of, now I get why people think like overnight sensations are like a real thing. Cause I'm like, oh no, I was actually like, I've been working on this for years. Like that there's this like disconnect with like when people see that there's a book coming out and like the actual work that goes into it. I'm just like, it's a little surreal.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. Like when you said years writing a book, I'm like, what?
Oh man, it took me like a year and a half to write the book, and then maybe like another year of edits. And right now we're in the home stretch. The book comes out in October, so we're just doing like the finishing touches on it. But it kind of like it. I know the book is coming out, but I kind of feel it doesn't feel real that a book I wrote is coming out. Like it's just crazy.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting, man. What about when you were younger, man? Like, were you always into like literature, reading, always a book nerd?
You know what? I was a movie nerd
Uh,
when I was a kid. When I was a kid, the like earliest memories are of me saying, I'm going to be a film director. Like that was my thing. I was always going to do films. And then my sophomore year in high school, I read the book Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. And that was the book that made me decide, oh, I want to be a writer. Because I think it was the first time I'd ever read a book where it felt like someone was putting words to the thoughts I didn't know I was having, if that makes sense.
like what? What kind of thoughts?
Like so the book Siddhartha is about the story of Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, the first Buddha. And it's just about his journey as like a prince, and then he leaves the kingdom, becomes an ascetic, rejects asceticism, becomes this like rich, wealthy man. Like it's his journey to get to be the Buddha. And it was the first time reading something where I read a character having internal thoughts that they did not express. And I was like, oh, what is this thing that you can do? Like it was so shocking to me because I think before then I wasn't much of a reader. I read the Goosebump books. I read like Scary Things to Read in the Dark. That book series. I butchered the title right now, but yeah, but like I was never really a book reader, and it was the first time that I was like, oh wow, like you can write something, and it's like a private movie between you and this writer. But then I realized the writer was this European dude from like the early 20th century that I was like, oh wow, like I've just had this, I feel like I know this man. Like if I met him, we would have this underlying connection that went beyond the everyday, job interview questions that we all give each other. Like a deep connection with this writer that I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. That was the thing that really put me on the road to wanting to become a writer.
That's so dope, man. Yeah, I remember. I mean, I think we all have thoughts in our heads, right? And we all, like, whatever we're going through, we always think like we're the only people in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I remember when I first started going to therapy, and I was telling my, I was like expressing to my therapist like, oh, I must be alone, and she pretty much said like, I'm sorry, do you think you're my only client? Like, this wouldn't be a living if you were my only client. You know what I mean? So like,
Yeah.
I don't know. It just, in many ways, it made me feel normal.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of the word. Probably normal, but I think media in many ways does that as well. Whether it's a movie or whether you read a book, like you feel not alone, right? Part of this community, if you will.
100%. I think now the podcast medium in itself has become such a big thing for me. There
Mhm.
are podcasts that I feel like regardless of what the hosts think, I feel like they're my friends because I've just heard hours and hours of conversation
Yeah.
that I'm like, like if I met someone, if I met them on the street or something, I would be like, hello, I'm a big fan, but inside my head I'm like, I know everything. So like it yeah, like it's interesting how like the different mediums that we have nowadays compared to like 10 years ago now inform our lives in these huge ways.
Yeah, yeah. Not for sure, man. It is kind of wild. I feel the same way. I listen to so many podcasters, and it's just like they're giving us such a sneak peek into their lives, and I'm like, oh, like if I walk up to them, I feel like we're best friends. They're just probably gonna look at me like, what the hell? Who is this guy?
Yeah, dude. Every time, like when I listen to your show, like every episode where the interviewee like pauses for you to like offer something, I'm like, yes, because that I think when you listen to a podcast long enough, like you want more of the host. If that,
Really?
yeah, like I totally believe that. I like once you become a fan of the podcast, it becomes less about like it's it's the hook that like brings you in, but it's like the podcaster that like keeps you. So I think like as I've listened more, I'm like, no, I want to learn more about Pavel and like like the stories that he has.
Bro, that is so interesting because so when you post, so I post a bunch of clips on Instagram, right, from like different podcasts, and like I've had so many dope guests that have been on there and they've said some dope shit, and I post clips on there, right? But legit, every time I post a clip of myself, the likes and the comments and the shares fucking through the roof, and I'm
Yes.
just like, oh, that's cool, right? Like there's validation, there's like self gratification in that, but at the same time, I'm like, I don't want to, like, I want the other stories to shine. And I don't know, it's so weird. Like, I don't, but that's so interesting. A matter of fact, there's this one podcast that I listened to, and my favorite episode is the one that she did of herself, her
Mhm,
own personal story. Like, all her guests are dope. It's great
mhm.
content, but the one of her, to your point, like, I felt like so connected to her. And
Yes.
I'm just like, yo, give me a part two. Like, there's so much you left out. It's so interesting, man.
It's and it goes back to that what we were just talking about of that like that relationship you like accidentally create with like a podcast and the hosts of that podcast.
Yeah.
It's a weird phenomenon.
Yeah. Anyway, it's interesting though. Like you got into writing and literature when you started reading that. But you said early on like you wanted to be a director in movies. Like tell me about when you were growing up and what sort of maybe professions you saw around you, or like what inspired you at first to think like movies.
You know, I have no idea why I thought I could be a movie director. I just, growing up, I never had anyone tell me like that was dumb. Do you know what I mean? Like it, you have like, now I have nieces and nephews and they tell me things like, oh, I want to be a veterinarian and I want to be a gamer. And I'm like, yeah, like do that 100%, do that. But as an adult in my head, I'm like, well, you're going to end up picking one over the other because there's just not enough time. And I was that, like, fortunately, I had adults around me who weren't like, Gus, you're being dumb. Like, you're not going to be a writer or something, or you're not going to be a film director. Like, I had people, like, my family almost like went the other way where they were like, oh, Gus wants to be a film director. Gus can watch any kind of movie he wants to watch. And like, there are no age restrictions. Like,
Really?
I mean, it sounds reckless. It might have just been that like, hey, we can plop Gus in front of the TV while we do our own stuff.
Yeah.
But like, that's how it ended up working for me, where like I had like, there were no filters for me. I decided as such. I can remember second grade, like career day, and I went in with my mom's beret. I was like, I want to be a film director. I don't know why I thought a beret was like what film directors wore, but that's what I did. I went in with like a black Steve Jobs turtleneck shirt and a beret. I was like, I want to be a film director. So second grade, that's like, I was already on board with being a film director. And my mom never let me, like, my mom never said, no, you can't watch that. No, you can't, like, or if I had questions about something, my mom would just tell me. So like, I feel like at an early age, I had such a strong sense of story, and just like how to like put together a like coherent plot, that I think now that's like my strong suit. Now I can plot out a story, no problem. Like that's like the easiest thing in the world for me. It's the like the characterization and like going deep into a story, that like that's where the real work is. But like, because I had that upbringing, that like stories for me are just this form of escapism, but also this way of knowing myself. That's really what like movies and books are for me. Are like, they're just mirrors. They're like every book I pick up, every movie I watch, it's a mirror. And that is really what I want to take part in. That's the thing that I like. I want to create something that will be a mirror for someone else. I don't want someone to read something I wrote and think like, oh, this guy's a genius. Oh, this guy, like that. I think when you're a reader, you think those things, but like once you get on the other side, you're like, oh, I like the thing I want to do most is hide myself and like put the work in front of me instead. So yeah, like that was the biggest draw. That was the biggest draw, was just like the feeling it gave me, and then wanting to share that feeling with other people.
Do you feel like when you were growing up watching, these movies or these shows, that it was a mirror for you? Like, did you see yourself being reflected in some of the content that you were watching?
No, I think what it did was let me know my world, like the world was bigger than what I was experiencing. Because I think like at such an early age, I had such a conflict with like my environment, with my family. Like I think my life is just very, very much defined around feeling like an outsider. So like when I would watch these movies, like I was I was 9 years old when I saw the movie Kids. I don't know if you ever seen that movie by
No.
Harmony Korine. Crazy movie, crazy movie. But so for example, me watching Kids, it was like this window into a world I had zero knowledge about, that showed just like the brutal aspects of life for teenagers. So I was like, so it's like the next level up for me. Like this is the stuff that like the people that are older than me go through.
Mm.
And I think what it did for me was just like, I don't know how to like it, how do we, maybe I can like unpack this later, but I feel like it clued me in to a greater indifference that the world has towards human lives. Like I think there is a general indifference to the things that happen to us and the things that we do. And a lot of times that is felt as a negative, but on another level, it is this great freedom that your mistakes, your accomplishments, your fears, your paranoias about the future, like it just all gets washed out in the ocean of like human experience. So like it just made me feel part of a bigger story, of like a universe. And then it kind of takes the pressure off of like an individual life, like making an individual life worthwhile or fulfilled or complete, and more just like living life and
Yeah.
just like getting, like getting your experience. Like that's really what that stuff taught me, and made me want to become a part of it, made me want to become a storyteller.
That's so interesting, man, because I think for many people, like they still haven't figured that out. You know what I mean? Like it takes people 50 years to figure out that life is bigger than just us. You know what I mean? Because
Mhm.
so many times we feel like the world is crumbling around us and all these things. Meanwhile, we're like such a small part of everything that's going on around us, right? And it's interesting you mentioned like you felt like an outsider growing up. Like, tell me a little bit about that. Like, in what way did you feel like an outsider?
You know what? So many ways. So like I mean, it's a very common thing
Yeah.
in Latino families. Like I think I was the kid growing up that like I didn't like spicy food. I
Oh
didn't speak.
man,
I didn't speak with
same.
I didn't speak with an accent when I was growing
Mhm.
up. Even though I don't like I didn't speak English until kindergarten. And once I learned English, like I just lost my Spanish. So like I stopped talking Spanish and I spoke English perfectly. Like I didn't even have an accent anymore. And I don't like spicy foods. So like the common thing was just like, oh, you're not Mexican. Like you're not Mexican. Oh, I like get me the elote but with butter and salt on it. I don't want any of like the hot sauce like that, hot pepper or anything. Like, oh, you're white. You're not Mexican or something. And like I know that's just like for someone else, that's just like an offhanded statement. Like it doesn't mean anything to them. But when you're a kid and you just hear it constantly, that like it just made me feel like I wasn't Mexican, like I was different. So then like I grew up always feeling like there were things you had to do. There were things you had to meet to qualify as
Yeah.
Mexican. And I wasn't meeting those, so I felt like I was like other, like I was this outsider. And then before I ever got a handle on like what it meant to be Mexican, I went from an all Latino school, an all Latino grade school, to like 90% Italian school. I went from sixth grade to seventh grade to like an all, like pretty much all Italian school. There was like a very small group of like minorities.
Mhm.
So now like that, entering that world, I felt like I was too Mexican. like
Yeah.
now like all my whiteness like is not coming into play, because like the white people are like, no, you're Mexican. You're in fact too Mexican. So then it just
Too,
made me
too Mexican.
dude, I like just like, yeah, like that time, like that 7th and 8th grade when I was like transitioning. I went from like growing up in Pilsen to like growing up in Bridgeport.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Bridgeport in Chicago is like a predominantly Italian neighborhood with like a history of like racist like tendencies, like racist experiences. I know when I transferred to this school, a young black man was killed by some teenagers who, like, he was like riding his bike through the neighborhood and they killed him. They like beat him to death.
Wow.
Um, so like that's what I was entering. That's what I like. That's all I remember going into this school was I was like, oh crap, like I'm different. And then like once I got there, they were like, you are fucking different. But
That must have been scary, man.
you know that wasn't scary because like I think even at that age I was like, well, like I'm not going to be going to school with the killers. Like there are, it's still a neighborhood. It's still like a vast group of people, but like that, what word is it? Like that temperament was there. Like my first like 1 or 2 weeks at this school, the principal took me out of class. So I'm like 13 years old. She like took me out of class in the hallway and she's like, hey Gus, like I know you're new to this school. We're happy to have you. Like you seem to be like a really good student. You're getting along with everyone. I just want to let you know, like, this is like a very like close-knit community. Like we don't tolerate any gangs or any gang activity. And I was like, what? Like what? And it immediately clicked in my head that I had just shaved my head. So like, and that's how I've always, I've like, I've up until that point, I had always shaved my head. And I realized what she was saying. So I was like, oh, no, I'm not a gangbanger. I just shaved my head. And then she was quick to be like, I'm not saying you're a gangbanger. I'm not saying you belong to anything. I am just saying we don't like tolerate that stuff in the school. So like right off the bat, like I was made to feel like, hey, like your Mexican level is too Mexican. Like you're like everyone, like for everyone else, I was like the stereotype of like what a Mexican was. But then I would go home and I wasn't Mexican enough. So like I just felt like always in between stuff. And there came a point where I decided like the in between is where I live.
Mm.
Like the in between is my solace, is my comfort, because no one fucks with me in the in between, because they're in their circles, they're in their worlds, they're comfortable in their worlds, and in the in between, in the undefined area, like I get to be free. So like I've grown up to actually enjoy solitude. Like I love my solitude. I love solace.
Same.
I am nourished by it. It is being with other people that like people that I love, like my friends and family. Like it's still draining on some level. Like, and being by myself is like what I find the nourishment in.
It's so weird because so I tell my girlfriend all the time. I was like, listen, it's not that I don't want to see you. Like this weekend, actually, like I was like, yo, I need the whole weekend to myself.
Mm-hmm.
And like, it's I've often been fearful of telling people that, especially women that I've been like romantically involved with, because I don't want them to internalize and think it's them. But I was
Mm-hmm.
like, honestly, I just need time to myself. Like, and like, it's not that I don't want time with you. It's just like, this is how sometimes I just need to regain my energy, right? And like I can't do that during the week because the 9 to 5 and then working on the podcast and all these things, right? So I feel like during the week my brain and my mind is occupied on just literally everything else and not me.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like I tell my girlfriend sometimes, like I just can't see you this weekend. I need the whole weekend to myself. Like but yeah, man, I feel you. And that must be so confusing, man, because like you said, on one side it's like you're too Mexican. Then you go back home and they're like, why don't you eat this food kind of thing? And I go through those same things till this day, man. And I'm 30. And I don't know if I'm ever going to get over it, but I talk about this on the podcast too, right? Like I often think long term, I have such a hard time enjoying and just living in the present moment. My therapist tells me this all the time, right? But I think about, I don't even know if I want kids, but if I did want kids, I'm always thinking like, am I going to be Dominican enough for my kids, for them to like understand what it's like to be Dominican, that like my grandma gave me, my mom gave me, you know what I mean? Like all those type of things. And that's a huge fear of mine. And my girlfriend's actually white right now. My girlfriend right now is actually white. And I think about that. I even told her, I was like, yo, I've always envisioned myself with a Latina. And like, maybe that's because I don't want to carry the burden of like being the only person responsible for carrying that culture. But but that shit, like you said, man, like these simple things that people think is just like, oh, like people brush it off. Bro, I'm still carrying that shit with me. I'm still like dealing with it, working through it, and understanding just like in my like Dominicanness or Latinidad or my blackness, all of those things. You know what I mean? So I get it, man.
Yeah, even now, even as I get older, I'm realizing, now I'm becoming the old dude at like my niece and nephew's parties. Like now I'm the uncle. Like I'm the uncle at the party. Now it's hit me, and I've told this to my wife, Montse, like, hey, we have to actually like, we can dance cumbia and salsa and merengue, but we actually have to learn how to dance, because like we're gonna be that old couple at the weddings, at the anniversary, that like the younger kids, they're gonna have to play that Spanish music because Gus and Montse are gonna be there, and they know that we like to dance cumbia or merengue or something. I'm like, we actually have to hold that up. Like it's our turn now. It's our turn to be that one couple that the young people are like, oh shit, like there they go. Like so, yeah, that stuff does weigh on me too.
So do you feel pressure in a certain way to like over pivot to one side and like be quote unquote more Mexican in a way?
Man, for a long time, yes. Now, no. Maybe maybe just like the dancing part. and that and that's maybe just because I've like always wanted to. Always wanted to like get really good at that stuff. But no, for my teens and my 20s, it dominated my life. Because of that stuff. So like I had mentioned, like elementary school, getting into high school was a whole different wrinkle to it, because so before high school, I was stuck between like my Mexican culture and going to this white school, and now having white friends and liking white girls, and like you know what I mean? Like
Bro, what
it
was that? Like,
it was
did you feel like a sellout? Because that's how I felt.
no, it I felt like a monster. I felt disgusting
What do you
because
mean?
because it was also the first time for these girls to like maybe be going to school with like someone who wasn't white.
Mm,
So like I always felt like, I don't know, like I always felt like once I went to a white school, it really hit me, this idea that like white dudes are the standard and everyone else is just a variation. Like
wow.
so like I always felt like I was like I not only did I have to do the like regular guy thing of like hitting on a girl, and like, but I also had to overcome the fact that I was Mexican.
Mm,
And it was tough because like, when you're young that age, no one has a filter. Like no one has a filter around you. I can remember like being at the gym with my friends, playing basketball, and like I think we like switched teams, and like I'm on like the side. I'm out of bounds, and there was this girl there, and she wasn't in my class. I barely knew her, but she looked at me and she was like, "Man, you are ugly." And it like, oh, it hurt me so much. Like it hurt me so bad, because not only was, I think for her, she was like, "Ugh, like you just got off the basketball court. Like you're disgusting right now." But like for me, I was like I'm already self-conscious that like I'm this like Mexican guy, like navigating this like this white space where I know racism exists, where I know like, you know, like jokes were being made like when I left the room, or people were saying like racist shit in front of me to like goad me into something. So like I have that playing, I would have always had that playing constantly in this world. So like to hear something like that was just like devastating. Um, so I had a terrible time trying to like date white girls, because then I went the other way of like, oh shit, like I have to then kind of like fit their parameters. So for the first time in my life, I grew hair. Like I started like growing my hair out, and I started trying to like, I tried to get like the man, like back when I was in grammar school, George Clooney was on ER. So like he had the like Caesar cut where it was like his hair pressed down, and I was like, oh, that's the look that I want. But I have the Mexican hair that like the longer it grows, it just keeps growing out into like an afro, not like, not it never goes down, my hair. Like it just keeps growing out and out and out. So like there was another thing I became self-conscious about, that like I couldn't get my hair like the white kids. Um, so it was awful time.
Bro,
But at the same time, like I also realized that maybe that wasn't my place. Like that wasn't where I was going to like blossom in that next level. Cause I realized, I realized early on, like 7th grade, I'm standing outside. 7th grade, new student, I'm standing outside with like the few friends that I've made in the time that I've been there, and we're standing outside with like the bullies of like the 7th and 8th grade. We're waiting for the school to open, and the boys just start like they started ranking the girls from 7th and 8th grade, just like on hotness, like who's attractive, who's the most attractive. And I'm listening to the boys talk, and they get to like the last 2 girls in the class, and for the girl that I was in class with, they were like, oh yeah, she's hot, but like her butt's too big. And for me, when I was in 7th grade, being caught between like Mexican culture, white culture, like I really didn't, I had very, very few opinions that of my own. But like in that moment when this kid said that, I realized like, oh, he's wrong. Like it was the first time that I'd felt like that I'd felt something that was true, that existed within me, not within anyone else. And I was like, oh, you're obviously wrong. Like it hit me that I was like, oh no, you guys don't know what you're talking about. And it was this burst of confidence that I was like, oh, actually, like they're not the arbiters of truth. Like they don't have all the truth. Like there's still truth to be had. And I've just found something within myself. So like those moments would start to add up as I got older. And that would be the thing that like kind of propelled me through high school to realize like, oh, I'm just not in the place that that's gonna feed me right now. And I just have to get through it. So like that's really the mindset that I took then, from like to get like out of my teens into adulthood.
yeah, I often say that, we often talk about code switching, and in context, we talk about it in, oh, we start doing that when we start doing professional things. But like most of us start code switching in like middle school, because at a very young age, at the very least, we just want to fit in, right? Like biologically, we want to be part of a tribe, we want to be part of a group. And, in your scenario, if you are in the school with a bunch of Italian kids, et cetera, and you see them growing their hair a certain way, you're like, oh, I want to do that. You know what I mean? Or you
Yeah.
see them talking about something, certain beauty standards, you're like, oh yeah, that's hot, this and that. But then you're like, oh shit, wait, no, that's not me. I'm trying to be someone else. But we all do it.
Yeah, and you don't realize it. Like
Mm-hmm.
you don't realize it until either you've made a mistake,
Yeah.
or like enough of the trauma happens that you like change. Because I also, I guess I also, I feel like I don't want to make it sound like I was always being like victimized, because I do also feel like I also had a part in like
Mhm.
in like misappropriating other cultures, because you know, in this time that I felt ostracized by like the worlds that I was existing in, like there was the place I could always go to was Black culture. So
Mhm.
like Fresh Prince, Bad Boys, hip hop. Like I could always fall back into that stuff, because like no one was judging me.
Mhm.
No one was judging me in this culture. But as I grew older, it gave me a sense of ownership, of like of like, oh yeah, like, you know, Mexican and Black people, like we're pretty much the same. And like I then grew up like, well, if I can't feel Mexican, or if I'm too Mexican for the white people, like Black people don't discriminate against me. So like I ended up I ended up taking on that like that role of like, oh yeah, like I can just live in Black culture. And it wasn't until I got older that I was like, oh, I'm also, there's like a Paul Mooney joke. I can't say it, but like he's like, you know, you like everyone wants to be a Black person until like it's time to be a Black person. And like that was me. That was very much me too. Like I was enjoying like Black culture until like it's time to be a Black person, and like I was not that. So
Yeah.
like it it's complex in that sense that like there are always layers. There are always layers that you're like having to like navigate and undo, and just kind of like acknowledge that it becomes, yeah, I don't want to say it becomes tiresome, but it does become like this, like you do feel like it's a labyrinth that you're like, oh, like when do I get to be me?
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I say this often, man. Like, because I'm part of, even at work, for example, I'm part of a few different employee resource groups. I'm part of the Latin at one, which Monte is in, and I'm part of the Black at one because I self-identify as Black. Just, I mean, the whole history, Dominican Republic, et cetera, whatever. But to your point, man, like I'm around people that look like me in the Latin at group, and it's so competitive in a way. Sometimes it's like, oh, I'm more this than you are, I was born there, you this and that. Oh, how's your Spanish, no accent? Oh, what kind of food do you, and the list goes on and on. Meanwhile, like I go into the Black ad employee resource group, and there's none of that. So in many ways, you know, depending on the circle, I do feel more comfortable sometimes because there isn't that judgment and those pre-qualifiers, if you will.
mhm.
And I'm so interested to hear about, you know, in your writing in particular, like taking all of your story and what you've been through, um in your book, you actually, the protagonist is a male, right?
Yeah,
And I'd love to hear just your thought process around, I don't know how to say this. It's like, I'm sure on one side you want to be able to show you, right, that mirror of who you are, and I'm sure part of you wants to, like, in some way show that he is Mexican, right? But on the other side, you're like, I don't want to be cheesy, I don't want to make the whole story about him being Mexican, right? And I'm sure there's like a time and place for both, but like, tell me about that thought process, man.
you know what? It's in the beginning of my writing, I really fought against that. I
Yeah.
really didn't want to address like being Latino in my
Right.
writing, because it just felt unfair. Like
Yeah.
as soon as people would find out I was a writer, or I wanted to be a writer, you know, the first thing they would say, like adults would always say like, oh, have you read Isabel Allende? Have you read Sandra Cisneros? And I'm like, why? Like, of course, yeah, yes, I have. I have read those people. But like, just because I'm Mexican, just because I'm Latino, doesn't mean like I have to read only Latino writers. Like, I don't want to write like My Vida Loca, or like some like top like Latino story. I want to write my own thing. Like, why does James Cameron get to do Terminator? And
Mhm.
like, you don't have to explain why the Terminator is Austrian. Like, I I want to write a Mexican Terminator that you don't know. You don't have to explain why he's Mexican. Like, That's what I want to write.
That's
But
such a good analogy.
but like as I started writing, I realized it is impossible for me to write about like my human experience without addressing that. Like I think every story a writer writes is reflective of themselves. Like they're writing about themselves. And I don't mean in some like pretentious way. I mean, even the writers who write like the airport novels, there's no way that you can write something for a long enough time that you yourself don't fall into it, that you don't bleed into it. And like I think like that is what ended up happening for me, because for this not like the novel that's coming out in October, I was reading over it, and it struck me just how much of the things we're talking about, like the main character like goes through, because he is also navigating this world of not feeling Mexican enough, of just being like not enough for his own family and not enough for his in-laws. And the entire, and like what makes it worse for him is that he also has like this like supernatural entity in his home that's like messing with him and his wife. But like that stuff just like is impossible for me to not put into my work. So really what it comes down to is not so much finding a way to include it or finding a way to keep it out, but just finding a way to make it fit the story I'm trying to tell.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's like a time and a place for like specific stories on like cultural backgrounds, etc. But yeah, I can't think of an actor that is Latino right now. I mean, John Leguizamo, for example, right? Like, I want to just see him play a beautiful story and a beautiful character, right? Like,
Hmm.
it doesn't, he doesn't have to play a Puerto Rican dad doing something that has to be very Puerto Rican as well, right? I mean, obviously,
Right.
like, yes, I want to feel represented, but I do also want to allow creatives to just write beautiful stories, you know? And if they want to do that, sure. But if they don't, cool, right? Like, I'm sure on some level, well, maybe not. I don't know. Like, on some level, like, do you talk? Because there's two routes, right? There's like the independent route, and then there's like going the publisher route. And there are certain benefits to both, right? But I'm sure on some level, when you start sharing your story, did you start getting some of that same feedback? Like, oh, this story isn't Mexican enough, or the story is too this or that? Like, did you get some of that feedback as well?
No, I didn't actually. I think the feedback was actually never about that. The feedback was always about the story, about the novel itself, which is, I guess, is, now that you mentioned that, I'm very fortunate that that was never an issue. No one ever brought it up, even with my publisher.
That's great.
Um, it was like it was actually something that they saw was informing of the story, and in fact, they brought ways for me to amplify the like culture in the story. You know, just like the idea of italicizing Spanish in the book, it was
Mm.
something I had never considered before. But my publisher brought it to my attention, like, hey, do you want to do italicize a Spanish or not? Because, and then they like provided me with these like examples and reasons. I was like, oh, it is something I've never even considered. And then doing my own research, I realized that it's actually something Latino writers fight to this day. Like the idea of italicizing Spanish in fiction versus not italicizing it, because Spanish speakers don't, there is no difference between the Spanish that you're speaking and the English that you're speaking. You just like, it's interchangeable for you. You go in and out of it. You don't like, you're not like, oh, and then yesterday I went to the supermercado. Like it's just like natural for you. And when you italicize it in a book, like it others it. And it was my like my publisher bringing this to my attention. I was like, oh, I actually do want to be part. Like I see what these Latino writers doing. I want to be a part of it. I like, let's not italicize it. So it's been actually the opposite. Like I've had such a great experience with my publisher, with MCD Books.
That's dope, man. And it's dope that they're even educating you, or like, damn, maybe I should have known this.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, oh yeah.
I knew about that.
But that all the time.
It's I think we spoke about this before too, right? But like I remember when I started reading Janot Diaz, like he would often put footnotes at the bottom of his books, and it was often like explanations or like additional context or historical background on the bottom of it. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, that was like the first time that I really saw that much explanation. I mean, although I appreciated it because like I learned the history of it. I remember reading white authors and I would never see that. Like I felt so insecure growing up about reading certain authors because I felt like I needed an encyclopedia or a dictionary next to me to like look up all of these terms. Um, and I think that's something else that authors are fighting around, like the expectation that we need to further explain ourselves versus the reader just like doing their own research.
Yes. I mean, Leia, that's a huge thing. Like the, yeah, if you're going to put like your cultural background like into your work, like you also don't want to like have to go on these like big like exposition blocks of like why you're explaining it, why you're including this thing. Like, yeah, no, like you don't want to do that. No one wants to do that. So like, fortunately, I've had such a great experience writing this book. Like I've never had any issues with the inclusion of like, I'm trying to like think of an example of my book and now I'm like blanking on it, but like I've never, there was never an issue of like, oh yeah, like I don't think this is gonna play for like a bigger market or something. Never any of that. So I've been super fortunate in that regard.
That's dope, man. Shout out to the publishing company.
Yes.
And it's so dope, man, seeing just like where you started and where you are now. And obviously like we're all continuing to work on ourselves, right? Like this isn't finished. Um, but as you continue to look at your journey, and you know, your continued growth, like what's one thing that continues to empower and inspire you to continue challenging yourself, man, continue to be your most authentic self?
Oh man, that is a good question. You know, my marriage, my marriage is one. I think like as I continue, I mean like as I continue being married, like there the idea of marriage changes so much. When I went into marriage, I thought like, oh, you know, when you love someone so much, you both like make this commitment to each other that you're going to be together forever, and that's what a marriage is. And now that I am almost a decade into my marriage, wait, think about it for a second. Oh, I'm almost a decade into my marriage. It's a marriage is that, but what it ultimately is this like container that is strong enough to hold like the fire of both of you as you like go like against each other. I think like you spend enough time with someone, like your insecurities, like the worst things about you come to the surface. And what a marriage does is a marriage like keeps you both together long enough that like those impurities like get burned up in the constant interactions with each other. And as I get older, I'm realizing like one of the biggest factors of like growth and change for me is my own marriage. Um, so that is like huge in and of itself. And the writing is also a huge part that goes into like my growth and my change, because each time it's like each time I go to write, I'm picking a new spot in the ground for like where to mine myself. And like I don't really know what I'm going to find, like what I'm going to dig up, but like there's going to be something there, and I'm guaranteed it's going to be something I didn't know was going to be there. And that is the pleasure of writing, is like getting to know yourself, because I mean we ultimately don't know ourselves. Like I think that's a guiding principle for me is, you know, when I hear people talk, when I hear like, you know, I think people are so very, very, very strong on like their beliefs and their opinions. Right now, it's a time of really fighting for what you believe, but also a lot of times I have it in the back of my head, this idea of like, well, we actually don't know what we're talking about, and we actually don't know who we are, and it's a constant discovery. So those are the two things that I would say like are the biggest points of change for me.